And Mayor and Council, I'm really pleased to introduce you to our next speaker, Seth Contreras, and he is from Fair and Peers Consulting. And Seth, take it away.
Great, thank you very much, Nicole. And yeah, Jeff, in your defense, I'll just say the story I heard behind Jeff Miles' name, I thought that was a subtle reference to vehicle miles traveled, VMT, but I guess that was perhaps, it'll always be a mystery. But yeah, good evening, Mayor Deasy and council members. I'm Seth, here today to give a educational session on some key concepts. If we move forward on the next slide, I want to cover key concepts on transportation planning to provide some definitions and give you some examples and options available to help the council make some informed decisions. I have a PhD in civil engineering and I've worked on sustainable mobility for the last 10 plus years, especially given that transportation is one of the fastest growing sectors when it comes to global emissions. I'm currently based in Long Beach, California, but I've worked nationally and internationally, including Washington, Oregon, Florida. Did some work with Uber in Washington, DC. In 2020, worked in Utah with their Inland Port Authority on developing their strategic business plan, and then most recently in Arizona. And I'll just start by saying these big picture concepts for the council members. If you are confused or uncertain about vehicle miles traveled or travel demand management strategies, that is perfectly okay. You are not alone in this. That's part of the reason why I'm here, to help explain this approach to managing your transportation system. And in a way, for the last 2 years in California, I've been somewhat of a VMT therapist in California for just not only council members and mayors, but engineers and planners as well, that for so long were using a level of service. So if we move to the next slide. So currently helping lots of cities in California switching from level of service to vehicle miles traveled, and it's a giant learning curve, which is completely understandable. It's not like you can just flip a switch and move over to VMT. It's a big learning curve, and this was a long time in the making in California. It took 15 years for them to switch to VMT. Governor Schwarzenegger signed Assembly Bill 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act, in 2006, and now here we are finally using vehicle miles traveled. And it requires a big shift in thinking, but really that's not unlike what we've had to undergo during the recent COVID-19 pandemic in terms of our shift in thinking and behavior, whether we're wearing masks, working and studying more from home, maybe shopping more online, perhaps even getting vaccinated. But let's start first off with just a definition of vehicle miles traveled, VMT. What is that? So if we go to the next slide, the best description I can give to you is, imagine you get in your car, you take a look at your odometer, the amount of miles that you have driven. That is VMT. So let's say you get in your car that morning, you drive 8 miles to work. That one trip, you drove 8 VMT, vehicle miles traveled. So it's about the distance that you've traveled. And this approach using VMT to evaluate projects and manage mobility, it's also a metric used in the carbon neutrality plan and their goals and policies for reducing greenhouse gases, since it's really, VMT is an indicator for greenhouse gases. It's really transferable. When we talk about VMT, we're talking about greenhouse gases. And later you'll see too that by working with VMT, it opens up to multimodal pathway options. That means walking, biking, and transit, which is also ties to your current active transportation master plan. But one of the biggest challenges right now in shifting to VMT is it's definitely not smooth. And one of the main reasons is because it requires a computer model that you can't just go and stand at an intersection and observe VMT. You need a computer model to generate and give you VMT as an output. That's why we're trying to overcome that by developing more VMT calculators, where a user can just use, just like any other calculator, to put in some inputs, and then it calculates automatically for you the VMT. And given the advancements in computer technology and even the use of cell phone data, it's making it much easier and faster to quantify VMT. And the current state of the practice is even using more activity-based models, whereas before the state of the practice was using trip-based models that focused on automobile travel. And but yeah, VMT is just that standard output of travel demand models. And I'll just say travel demand models, those are decision support tools, that it's emphasis there on support, that it's not meant to be a decision tool, but really a decision support tool moving forward when evaluating scenarios. So then if we look at the next slide and look at the side-by-side comparison, what is level of service and what is VMT, to give you a visualization here. So level of service is looking strictly at delay to drivers. So those behind the wheel, drivers in a car, what is their average delay per driver to, let's say, traverse an intersection? And so to give you a side-by-side comparison on what, let's say, a standard level of service A roadway looks like versus a poor level of service F that has failed in terms of average vehicle delay that only looks at the driver, you can see the difference here, that on the left, yes, you have really good level of service A, minimal delay to the drivers, but in terms of the economy, just the level of activity, businesses, health, equity, that it in a way has a level of service F when it comes to those economic metrics. But then on the right, looking at that level of service there for the traffic, yes, you have poor levels of service, but the economy, you see more people walking, more activity. It just opens up more doorways to look at your roadway network beyond just looking at level of service. And in a way that most agencies right now in California, they're still using level of service for site access in terms of driveway location and even local circulation considerations, queuing, for example. But they are now required in California to use VMT for measuring the impact of a project. They're still using level of service, but they're required to use VMT for measuring the impact. So in a way, we're sort of in that in-between phase right now of not removing LOS completely from the equation, but there is that shift now to VMT. And we know traffic is a very important local and regional issue, but so is housing and education, safety, and perhaps even climate emergency. But there are options to managing mobility other than using level of service. And cities are taking a different multimodal approach beyond LOS. San Francisco, for example, they opened up Market Street to make it a complete street in 2020. And they have a history also of tearing down their double-stacked freeway. And so not just in California, Dallas, for example, most recently removed some highways and even had some highway expansion projects stopped due to the Civil Rights Act lawsuit. So there's a role there when it comes to infrastructure and equity. So if we move to the next slide to give you one recent example of a project that was evaluated using vehicle miles traveled. This is a project we worked on in Los Angeles, the International Airport, LAX. They are in preparation for basically preparing for the 2028 Olympics, and so modernizing the airport. And one of those modernizations is putting in a new automated people mover tram. But also part of the project, there are several new built overpasses that are being constructed as part of this project in and around the terminals. So in other words, it's adding new lanes, both through lanes and turning movement lanes. So when doing the analysis, and we were on this project, we found that there was no LOS effect, because of the overpasses and adding new lanes and turning lanes, but we ended up determining that there was a significant VMT impact per CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. And the main reason there is because of this concept of induced demand, which I'm going to talk about next in the next slide. So yeah, induced demand. This is an actual phenomenon. It does take place, and I know it's a term that is discussed a lot, and so I want to just take a moment here to describe it, to help describe what exactly is this induced demand, because it is based on observations, not just theory. And really, in a nutshell, induced demand, it's one of those unintended consequences of adding new lane capacity as a strategy for reducing congestion. So in other words, you increase your supply, your number of road lanes, and then the demand increases over time. So that's induced demand. It's a well-known theory in our practice, and it's based on observations. And really over time, what we've seen is about 90% of all new road capacity improvement projects, they do fill up within 5 years. So then the question that is asked by agencies is, why is that? Why is that happening? That within 5 years, we're right back to having traffic as it was in the previous years. And the reason is because of induced demand, and there's theory to that. But if we go to the next slide to describe what exactly, why that is happening. So that second bullet point, induced VMT, is truly new, that it's not necessarily shifting traffic from other routes, but it's really new VMT. You're generating a new demand for vehicle travel, and that increases fuel consumption and emissions. And all the research has shown that the elasticity that's attached to that, how much are you inducing your demand in the long term? The elasticity, for every 1% increase in lane miles, you can increase your VMT by 1%. So it's almost a one-to-one exchange. So if I build a new 1 lane mile of roadway, I can expect an increase in 1 VMT on that roadway. So why exactly is that happening? If we go to the next slide, I'll show you the basic sort of economics crash course right here. But what's happening is you look at the supply demand curve, that intersection there where you see the C right in the middle, that's your vehicle miles traveled. That's where the demand and the supply curve intersect. And here cost is being represented in terms of travel time, that folks really tend to value their time in terms of what's the fastest, quickest, safest way for me to move from A to B. And that does tend to be the automobile for now. So it does show right there, you can see there is your vehicle miles traveled for that demand and supply. Now imagine we take that S, the supply curve, and we shift it to the right. What if we add new road capacity? What if I build a brand new lane on each side and we shift the curve horizontally to the right? What that does is that improves the travel time on that roadway. So then the demand then increases. You can see it goes from V to V apostrophe. So that change, that is your induced demand. That's what's happening there. So this is based on theory, but also observations. And then to wrap it up on induced demand, we go to the next slide. You'll see just some causes here. What is actually causing this? So I talked about how number 2, it's really a mode shift towards the automobile, that it's becoming more attractive to drive an automobile because you've improved the travel time. But then that increases VMT. And then number 1, longer trips. So you add in a new lane, you've added in new miles of lane, so that's more VMT. You've got newly generated trips, so that's increases in VMT. In terms of route shifting, it can go up or down in terms of route changes. And then land use. You know, Jeff was just talking right now about the importance of land use, and by this induced demand, it tends to lead to more development having that sprawl effect where they build further out because you're starting to improve travel times. So that's induced demand for you in a nutshell. But moving forward on to the next slide, let's talk about just what are the options available. You know, you've been hearing this term TDM, Transportation Demand Management Strategies, and you know, aside from road expansion projects to manage mobility, what tools do we have available, and what are some proven methods so that you know, you can make good decisions and investments? And so one approach here is to use TDM, Transportation Demand Management Strategy, for reducing the emphasis on single occupant vehicles. So you're tackling VMT plus a form of congestion management. And really what's happening here is you're shifting to managing the demand versus instead of managing the supply. The previous kind of train of thought was to only just manage the supply, add in new lanes, extend queue lengths. You're managing the supply, and that was very important. But now this shift in thinking is also now looking at trying to manage the demand, the users of that road network, the users that are sitting in that turn pocket. That what if we can, in a way, build and manage that demand in order to use the existing resources and infrastructure more efficiently. And so on the next slide, you'll see we developed this handbook we co-authored called the Handbook for Analyzing GHG Emission Reductions. And you can see there, it's a handbook, it's a summary of TDM strategies that are based on empirical review and peer-reviewed evidence. But what I want to point out too is the title of this handbook. It not only has greenhouse gases and climate vulnerability in it, but look at that last sentence. It also has health and equity. So by shifting to TDM, it in a way, it allows you to also look at what could be some other important values, such as health and equity. And we know that public health is a growing area of emphasis, especially in the context of COVID and equity. And this handbook, it presents a range of possible multimodal, multi-geographic options, but understanding the pros and cons and the feasibility is very important. But what this handbook did is it created for the first time sort of a one-stop resource manual guide for decision makers to point to and go to and flip to in order to just see what options are available and just what level of resources and investment are required. So to give you an example here, we go to the next slide. As part of the data gathering task for MetroPlan's long-range transportation plan update, we summarized the handbook in what I would say an accessible table format, where we summarize different TDM strategies. So for example, here's one TDM strategy related to transit. And so this would be a TDM strategy providing discounted transit passes. So either the city or let's say NAU or a major employer providing transit passes or subsidies for the users. And based on the research, based on the evidence, by doing that, it can reduce VMT as much as 5.5%. So that's not to say that you can expect a 5% decrease in VMT right away, but up to a maximum of 5%. It can vary just depending on maybe how much of a discount is being provided and how well the transit service is connected and how frequent it passes by. But this is based on evidence and research based on peer cities and how they've provided discount passes or employers and how much VMT was then observed to reduce over time. And it's ultimately TDM, it's about providing all individuals, regardless of their location or economic status, some practical and cost feasible, viable options of travel other than the private vehicle. And there's something to be said too about economic competitiveness, that more and more companies are considering accessibility to destinations via walking, biking, and transit as an important deciding factor when selecting a city to locate their offices. And one recent example, Utah Inland Port Authority, as part of their business plan, they developed and identified carpool shuttles and transit connectors for their future employees and employers, and to work with the city to identify and create feasible routes. So if we go to the next slide, here you'll get to see the spectrum of options. So this is the handbook in a nutshell, that if you only had one page to look at, it would be this page here. Jeff was talking about how TDM, it's about a package or menu of options, and the ones that give you the most bang for the buck over there to the left are really tied to land use. I want to make a really important point here is that land use is a really important just factor in terms of reducing VMT. So whether it's building more transit-oriented development, increasing density, both residential and jobs, and we know that based on some recent surveys, housing is one of the top issues in Flagstaff. And these could be some large-scale projects, but priced parking as well is a key TDM strategy. But also, too, what TDM does is it allows a spectrum. This is a second point I want to make. It allows a spectrum of options based on geography. So whether it can be applicable to the urban downtown core, or if you're more of in a suburban area, let's say Donny Park or Belmont, that providing more, say, pedestrian connectivity, it allows you to be able to address whether you're in suburban or urban areas. It's not only just applicable to urban areas. So in summary, when comparing the two approaches, VMT and LOS, building road capacity is least effective in the long term and can be costly, and then transitioning to more dense mixed land use is the most effective. You could see there the 30% reductions in VMT. And then TDM, all those other smaller reductions that you see there, the full spectrum, it falls somewhere in the middle in terms of being less costly, more effective, and accruing some benefits in the near term and long term. And then to give another example on street connectivity, if we go to the next slide, for example, on street connectivity, really what this is talking about.
My apologies to interrupt. Councilmember McCarthy put a question in the chat saying, what does TOD mean?
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so yeah, we do have a lot of acronyms in the transportation planning world, but TOD stands for transit-oriented development. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you. So yeah, back to street connectivity. Street connectivity, and you can see a picture there. Really what it's referring to is converting, let's say, cul-de-sacs or dead ends and creating a grid street network when it comes to street connectivity. So it helps facilitate a greater number of trips, but also a greater number of shorter trips is what I meant to say, is it creates a greater number of those shorter distance trips rather than having to go all the way around because it's a dead end or cul-de-sac. You can make shorter trips, hence reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And there's something to be said too about complete streets as well, or really it's about complete communities. So one city I just recently worked with here in Southern California, they wanted to repurpose their 4-lane road and open up one of the lanes for on-street dining, walking and biking space. They only did it as a pilot for the community to just not, scare people and assume that this is just going to be permanent. But all throughout COVID, they ended up getting some really good data and feedback, even from the businesses, an increase in retail sales. And so now they're making that permanent. So the street connectivity, it's also too about connecting more with the adjacent land uses and communities. And then we go to the next slide on active transportation, give some examples there. Here's some photos I took. This is just based on one afternoon while I was in Flagstaff in May. I took these 3 photos here just to point out that, number one, even with minimal bicycle infrastructure, you still see a demand for riding, but also two, the users, they extend beyond just college students. That I see folks here, of all ages riding their bicycles, and even in unprotected bike lanes, still riding and mixing in traffic, which I know is legal on the streets in Flagstaff, but not necessarily safe. But to me, these are my heroes right here, the ones riding next to the traffic. And some lessons learned too on the bike share. Jeff talked about in 2018 how there was the yellow bike share program. When diving deeper into that pilot or that bike share system, what they found was that the students, they were reluctant to give their credit card information. So there's something to be said about creating a bike share system where you can give people more options opposed to just putting in credit card information, maybe on a pay by use purpose and paying by cash. But also there was discounted passes that competed against the bus pass, that they weren't necessarily given they were given an option whether to choose the bike share or the discounted bus pass. They weren't really given, both at the same time. So there was some competing interest there in terms of discounted passes, but just some lessons learned there. And then moving to the next slide, Jeff talked about how there might be upcoming more bike share programs in terms of e-bikes and even e-mobility. So this field of shared mobility that has been around, we're in the age of shared mobility, the Ubers, the bike share, the e-scooters, including e-scooters that are being used in Denver. It's really about the data platform and how more and more folks are having access to smartphones and having on-demand mobility options available. And the thing about shared mobility too, we tend to get criticism or feedback that it's only applicable in really good climate areas. But from what I've seen in the research and our work as well across the US, Minnesota, which tends to be very cold, they have a bike share program. Las Vegas launched a bike share program in 2016. They're on the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of extreme heat. DC, Washington, DC, this is an image I just took last week while I was in DC for the annual TRB, Transportation Research Board meeting, where there was literally snow on the ground, but still folks, you could see some empty bike racks there. And that following morning, if you hit play on that image for us, Nicole, this is a video I took going down a street that had a bike lane, and within just 15 seconds, I saw a couple jogging. This was on a Saturday morning. I saw a bicyclist in the bike lane. Temperatures were somewhere around the teens. And then an individual was walking their dog on the sidewalk. So that was over a span of just a few seconds. So to say that shared mobility or bike share or e-scooters or walking facilities are not needed in areas where you have extreme weather events or extreme temperatures, I would say, that we do see it across the US. And even Park City, Utah, for example, you mentioned that you might be using e-bikes later on. They found that in Park City, Utah, having e-bikes in their bike share system that helped improve ridership, just given the hilly terrain similar to Flagstaff, and they also have seasonal tourism and significant seasonal changes in weather. And the e-bikes, they found it helps extend the trip length. So on average, a bike share maybe only goes 1 mile, but for e-bikes, the average trip lengths were around 5 miles. Great. So then my last section, I just have, 6 more slides to go. Are we okay on time, Nicole? I could wrap this up in 4 minutes, the emerging trends. Take the silence as...
I think we're great, Seth.
Yeah. Oh, Mayor, I was going to ask. Yeah, I think we're good. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, this is the last finale here, technology and emerging trends that, as part of long-range planning, when looking and forecasting out 20, 25 years, it's important to just stay on top of trends as well. So the present on emerging technologies such as autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles, but emerging travel behavior during COVID-19 and the pandemic. So for example, more people working and studying from home and the increase in online shopping and what those implications are on travel. It's really important. So we'll go to the next slide. In terms of autonomous vehicles, they, just like TDM, Transportation Demand Management Strategies, they come in all different shapes and sizes, and we're seeing more cities testing different levels of autonomous vehicles. But just one word of caution that I'll say about autonomous vehicles, that if a city is going to allow autonomous vehicles to be tested on their roadways, that the models have confirmed that making vehicle travel more convenient, such as autonomous vehicles, it does have the potential to significantly increase vehicle use and reduce transit ridership. So what we're seeing happening in San Francisco is they don't want to necessarily negate this technology, but rather, can we use autonomous vehicles, for example, to maybe create some micro-transit options, those feeder points, the first last mile connectors and autonomous rapid transit to help feed into the transit system. So coupling this technology with transit could be one option. And that's what we saw. If you go to the next slide and click play, this happened in Las Vegas. They did a 1-year pilot in 2018 of this micro-transit shuttle. And yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't look like the video. It's just a short, quick video of that little driverless vehicle shuttle that fits about 8 people going around the downtown area of Las Vegas and Fremont. And the key takeaways they found there, why people were open, or there was positive feedback on that experience, because they piloted it for an entire year, this micro-transit feeder system. Number one, it was slow. So the vehicle went relatively slow, so it wasn't fast. That helped in terms of comfort. The microtransit, the shuttle, was free, and also too, it was a shared ride. So when you're in a vehicle that's driverless, imagine you're in it by yourself. There tends to be a little bit more anxiety. But if you're in a vehicle with, let's say, 7 other people and you're sharing that ride, you're kind of sharing the risk. They found that really made a huge factor in terms of just positive feedback on deploying autonomous vehicles. And then in terms of Flagstaff, we go to the next slide. Yeah, you can manage the demand, but you can also still manage the supply in terms of rethinking the curve. So you've got park flag and priced parking, but you've got a whole system there of curb that you can still manage in terms of the supply, and rethinking that in terms of parking, maybe opening it up for just more dining options, pick up and drop off loading areas, and not necessarily providing so much parking supply, but rethinking about how to manage that parking supply more efficiently. And then lastly, the next slide, second to last slide, Ford and Detroit. Something here just about equity. So Accessible Streets Studio, they're piloting, this is Ford, they're piloting with Detroit in underdeveloped transportation network areas. And this big shift in thinking, they're looking at trying to use technology, autonomous vehicles, real-time information systems on transit to help overcome these barriers. And we're here a day after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and in 2015, I saw Secretary Anthony Foxx, former Secretary of Transportation Anthony Foxx, give a speech in Washington, D.C. on the role of infrastructure when it comes to equity. And here is Anthony Foxx, former mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina. He grew up in Charlotte, and he spoke about his childhood experience on how his neighborhood was essentially divided by a giant freeway overpass, that when he would walk outside, you just see this giant wall, and it served as kind of a barrier for him. And so he spoke then, this was in 2015, about equity, and this is the Secretary of Transportation, who oversees the U.S. Department of Transportation and Highways program, speaking about just the role of infrastructure, that yes, climate and vehicle miles traveled is important, but thinking about infrastructure in terms of how it can or cannot divide or bridge communities together. And I just thought that that was really powerful when he presented on that. So finally, in summary, to wrap things up, very last slide here, final 3 points I want to make. The big shift, it requires first a big shift in thinking. So this is just a different approach using VMT versus TDM. The importance of monitoring, number 2, travel behavior and trends, and especially in terms in light of COVID, which is now an endemic. And then number 3, the role of technologies, that how can electric vehicles or autonomous vehicles, how they can fill gaps in terms of creating more gaps when it comes to equity. So thank you very much for your time, and we can now open up to questions if that's the next thing. Mayor Deasy, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Seth, and all of our presenters so far this evening. Mayor and Council, we wanted to just hit the pause button here as we anticipated that there may be some questions. So I will open this up and see if there are any questions from the Council.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you, Dr. Contreras. Really appreciate it. We do have, so Council knows, a few public comments. So we'll hold off on discussion until after, but if you have direct questions, I'm happy to add you in before we take public comments. So I do see Vice Mayor followed by Councilmember Shimoni.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Dr. Contreras, for that great presentation. So how do cities think about, you have certain roads in every city where there's some traffic backup, and so there's a fair amount of pressure to provide other methods for accessing various parts of town, building more roads. How do you instruct cities about a different way to think about that in terms of induced demand?
Yeah, thank you, Vice Mayor. That's a good question. And yeah, this big shift in thinking, it really requires, first off, just having those conversations and educational sessions with the community to help understand these concepts, including induced demand. I think, and including them as well, the cities at the very beginning of the planning process is really important as well, and just understanding the trade-offs. And I think also providing examples so that they can relate to it is really important, because you can present all these concepts and definitions, but I find that when you show examples, when you show a side-by-side of level of service versus VMT, LOS A and F, that to visualize this, and I know it's been a challenge in our profession to be able to describe that in a relatable way, but I think we're making good progress.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Councilmember Shimoni.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you to everybody who presented, and Seth, especially a big thank you to you and being with us today and sharing your expertise. We really appreciate it. A couple quick questions for you. You talked about VMT in relation to greenhouse gases. Can you talk about VMT in relation to idling time? We're having a lot of conversations about projects and idling time being an argument being made as to why we need a larger project or a more efficient level of service. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. So yeah, the vehicle miles traveled, when I gave that example at the beginning of how when you got in your car and you go to work and you drove 8 miles, you did, for those 8 miles, you did stop at perhaps a couple of lights. There was some idling time there. So there was some time there in terms of maybe it took you 20, 25 minutes. And factored into that 8 VMT when estimating the greenhouse gases of that 8 VMT. A lot of these models are very sophisticated where it takes into account the full cycle of that trip, including even just starting your car. That once you start that vehicle, you're giving off some emissions, then you hit the gas, you're doing some idling, and then accelerating. So it's taking into account that full cycle when estimating it. But you bring up a good point on idling at intersections. It comes down to when you're evaluating a project, what are your evaluation metrics? Is idling and queue lengths your top priority, which, yeah, for some areas and some communities can be, but as part of the long-range transportation plan, we're bringing in other important performance metrics that also speak to public health, equity, safety, and so it's not just considering idling and queue lengths, but based on even just the declaration of climate emergency that I saw took place there in Flagstaff, that's also a top priority. That bringing in VMT allows you to also consider that metric in addition to just idling, but you want to look at everything at the same time. There's going to be some trade-offs.
I appreciate that, and I love that you brought up priorities and that public health, equity, and safety you mentioned. I fully agree with you. Just quick question, in your experience working with other municipalities, how do we as a council body help our team shift away into adopting different sets of priorities?
Yeah, that's a good question, because those numbers that I showed, the 30%, I don't mean to say that overnight you're going to see that 30%, that this is a shift. It's going to take some time, but luckily you're not the first ones out of the box doing this, that there have been plenty of other even peer cities as close as Park City doing this and taking those. What I have found also to be very strategic in what cities have done is doing pilots rather than saying that we're going to do this new project, bring in, let's say, a new bike share system permanently, or repurpose a road and make it only one lane in each direction and make it a complete street. That instead they said, look, we're just going to pilot it for a couple of weeks or a couple of months. Let people try it out. I think that tends to help ease some of that initial tension and uncertainty, which is completely understandable. But I have found that just initial step towards doing a pilot and only offering it as just short term to test it out, that hopefully maybe you'll fail quickly and learn from it, just like the yellow bike share program, so that you could then come back and do it just more efficiently the next time around.
Okay, and then my last question for you, at least for now, is a point of somewhat of a contentious point internally with our team has been the thought about the idea that building more roads is not only more expensive but less effective at addressing congestion, with congestion being the underlying point of what we're trying to prioritize. Can you speak to, again, that idea that building more roads is not only more expensive but less effective at addressing congestion? Is that something that you subscribe to as well, or can you speak to that?
Sure. Yeah, this is one of those ongoing debates, and I wouldn't necessarily say that I subscribe to one or the other. I go based on just the empirical evidence and data and what we've observed. And the majority of the time, you add that roadway lane, within 5 years, it fills back up. And then we're asked by the engineers or the city mayors, why did that happen? And it's because of induced demand. But yeah, this big shift in thinking, it's about not just thinking about that road lane, but thinking about the users of that system and trying to manage the demand side, manage the users, and giving just them more options as well. I find too that we're also at a time during COVID where it was kind of almost like a national experiment where everyone stopped driving for a period of time. And for the first time also, we saw greenhouse gases did go down across the US in terms of from the transportation sector. But then VMT picked right back up as things started to open up. But that was proof there that by reducing our vehicle miles traveled, we do reduce greenhouse gases? And is that something you as a community prioritize more than, say, adding a few more seconds of delay to your travel time, or adding more queue lengths to how you have to wait? That what are your priorities right now? And I just think greenhouse gases, it's more, that's thinking more long term in terms of just community values and how you want your community to look like, not just today, tomorrow, but 20 years from now. And also, we talk a lot about greenhouse gases, and that's in the long term, but there's something to be said. I never even touched on emissions and air quality and air pollution. And those you get immediate short-term, near-term benefits quickly on the air pollution and public health side. The greenhouse gases is more about the climate, but the emissions from those road vehicles, there's something to be said about the air pollution impacts.
Thank you, Seth. And Mary, my last question for Seth at this point is just, you said that Flagstaff has a minimal biking infrastructure, and you spoke about the heroes, but yet the dangers that exist for the conditions that we have. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on this, because when I look at Flagstaff, I think of a mountain town with a very active community, a lot of athletes, a lot of people wanting to be active. I think that we have such an opportunity to lead the nation as an example, but others that I speak to don't agree with me. I'm just curious at times, what your thoughts are when you look at Flagstaff and our community and our size and how we're landlocked. If we didn't have just a minimal biking infrastructure, but a holistic network that was completed, what are your thoughts about our potential?
Well, yeah, you mentioned their potential, that the behavior and demand management side, that you already have a really good hiking trail network that has been there for quite a long time. That I was really impressed by that in my visit last May. But yeah, I mean, I have many thoughts. I want to stay objective in my presentation and just present facts and help to just try to bridge that gap in understanding and in VMT. But you're right. I do believe that there is a lot of potential when you're already having a community that is very active, that lives active lifestyles, that opens up doorways to more potential for those more active transportation modes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Shimoni and Dr. Contreras. Councilmember Aslan.
I appreciate that.
I just want to note that we do have a few more slides left, so we can get just a little bit more info, but Councilmember Aslan, you're welcome to ask Dr. Contreras regarding some of the topics discussed here.
I was just going to say, I realize we're going to move on here. I did want to take a moment specifically just to thank you, Dr. Contreras. Seth, I really appreciate your leadership on this issue. And when I talk about leadership, what I'm talking about is your willingness and ability to be out in front on a conversation that is critical to our future and to the quality of life of our children and our families moving forward. And I will just add to that, that I get really excited when I think of Flagstaff's role in trailblazing these concepts and making the big shift happen for Arizona. Shared mobility, your questions around induced demand. These are conversations we should have been having 20 years ago, and solutions we should have been implementing a long time ago, so that we're already enjoying the fruits of those labors. And I just want to take a moment to lift you up personally for choosing a career path that kind of puts you in the crosshairs and makes you a target. It's not easy to speak truth to power and to bring about big change, especially when it comes to bureaucracies and elected officials and engineers and those sorts of circles. So thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your trailblazing attitude and your expertise, and just watching you work and listening to you and watching your presentation. You're making our job easier here in Flagstaff of helping to bring these changes about. I know we have a willing culture and a willing city staff and management team and leadership eager to figure out how to do this. And with you providing us a path forward, I'm using all these transportation puns very intentionally, by the way. It just makes it easier for everybody, and it makes all of us a little bit more comfortable. As you were saying, you know, when you get a bunch of people in that driverless car, the anxiety goes down a little bit. And so I just want to take a moment to appreciate you personally. Thank you.